I'm Dr. Lori Joan Swick. I write the untold stories of historical women, focusing on those whose influence in sacred and spiritual traditions I feel deserves more credit than it actually got. And today on She Started It, I want to share with you the story of Evelyn Underhill of England, who gifted the world by being the first person to do a really comprehensive study on what mysticism actually is. And not only did she do that, but in studying what the world scriptures, what writings about mystics by mystics, just exhaustively, she told us what the mystic way is, as she called it. She taught us how to be mystics if we are so inclined. So I really want to talk about her today. In my last video blog, I talked about Evelyn Underhill's definition of what mysticism is. And if you missed that, you might want to take a look back at it because it really helps set up what I'm going to share with you today, which is how to be a mystic. But also in the last video blog, I focused on Rabia Abasra, a Sufi mystic who really exemplifies the process of being a mystic. And so again, if you didn't get a chance to look at that, you might enjoy taking a peek back at it. But today, we're going to focus on Evelyn Underhill. She lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Her pivotal book, her blow-away book on mysticism is entitled Mysticism, and it was first published in 1911. So she really was ahead of her time as far as bringing the world up to the curve on this. I mean, this was after the Great Enlightenment, and you had a lot of thinkers. You had Helena Blavatsky teaching the world about occultism and things going on. But I mean, her work was definitely influenced by her time. But she also was a real pioneer in it. She was an only child. Her parents, though loving, were not really invested in her mystical pursuits. She said she had very dramatic mystical experiences as a child, which prompted her life's work. But again, she got not a lot of support at home, so she had to kind of go out on her own and figure out what this experience was that she'd had, who else is having it, what does it mean, that sort of thing. So thankfully for us who were interested in this sort of thing, she did. She later married, had no children. Her husband wasn't really into it either, so she had to blaze her own trail, if you will. But at any rate, she was an amazing person. Her religious journey, her journey into spiritualism, started with a period of being and I can say this really, I can, an agnostic. And you probably know that means that an agnostic isn't, they're not atheists. It's not that they don't believe in God or don't believe in something else or ultimate reality. But they're like, I don't know. You know, how can you know? Nobody can really know if there's a God, if there's something out there, and it's just a resignation to that we'll probably never really know for sure. And then she went through a period of being a Platonist. She studied Platonism, and Plato really gave her a good foundation for starting to understand the mystical experiences that she'd had. And when she writes about Plato, she presents him as a mystic, which she's the first person I've ever heard of that's done that. But when she talks about like his theory of forms, in his allegory in the cave, and she cites what he said there. I think she's right. I really do. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But later on, after her Platonism, she was drawn to Catholicism. And again, her parents and her husband were not in favor of this, but it's kind of understandable that she would because the Catholic tradition has such a rich tradition of well versed and well written mystics, if you will. And you think of Saint John of the Cross, who the very prolific Spanish mystic who also had great influence on Teresa of Avila. There was Ignatius of Loyola, Julian of Norwich, and Underhill studies, among other mystics throughout the world. She studies them and writes about them, and you can see why she might be drawn to the Catholic tradition as a mystic, because there's a real rich lore there, and there's a real foundation for it. And she is known as a Christian mystic, is usually what she's referred to, and she was. But her studies on mysticism and what she offered us on mysticism really transcended the Christian tradition, and any tradition for that matter. She was educated at home. Though we don't know much about her now, she's not talked about a lot. She was very well respected and known in England during her time. Was awarded an honorary doctorate at Aberdeen College. She was made a fellow at King's College, which is no small feat for a woman of her time. She was one of the first women to speak on spiritual matters in England. She was probably the first person in England who spoke ecumenically, who worked to bring the different churches together, for just to discuss things and for interreligious dialogue, if you will, which kind of says a lot to me about what kind of a person she actually was. I always admire that. She wrote satirical poems. She wrote her poetry, surprisingly enough, was satire on legal dilemmas, which shows she had a deep interest in psychology, and which she writes about in her book very prolifically, and ethics. She wrote novels about people on mystical journeys. Her heroes and heroines usually she showed how they went through trying to amalgamate their spiritual life that they were becoming aware of with their physical life, which again was probably another way of exploring her experiences and trying to share it with the world in a very profound way. But perhaps the most fascinating thing she might have done, in my mind, was that she was probably, with her studies on mysticism and how you go into your deep levels of consciousness to experience mysticism, she was probably among the first of the depth psychologists, and she predated Carl Jung. So she is a very noteworthy person in terms of starting things in spiritual and sacred traditions, and I think she deserves credit for that. But that having been said, I want to go on and talk a little bit about what she says you need to do if you want to be a mystic. And she's very clear about the fact that, some people are, some people are predisposed to this, and some people she doesn't believe necessarily are. But it takes a definite choice. If you're going to be a mystic, you have to live in the mystic world and not the physical world. You have to decide what level of existence that you want. She believed that mysticism, throughout her book on mysticism, she wrote that it is not a way of knowing, it is a way of being. So you become a mystic and you just are a mystic. And again, if you look back at my video blog on Rabia Basral, you can tell she's somebody who was just a mystic. She just didn't operate on the physical level anymore. But anyway, so she said that becoming a mystic has five distinct stages that she saw throughout all of her studies on the different mystics that she took a close look at. The first one is the awakening of the self to divine reality, to higher consciousness, to the absolute. And Evelyn herself very diplomatically uses a lot of different terms for God, if you will, or Allah, or the beyond, or just because she's very aware. And another thing she talks about a lot in her book is that this experience is ineffable. You can't really describe it. Okay, so whatever your experiences of ultimate reality or the absolute or true beauty, there's no real words for it. So she changes it up and uses different terms for that. But she says it usually starts with an abrupt and clear experience with a feeling of intense joy and exhilaration. So once this happens, I mean, if you've had a mystical experience, according to Underhill, you know it. You know it was different. You got a taste of it and you want it really bad. But then all of a sudden, having had that sense of perfection, the sense of real truth, the sense of absoluteness. Can you see Plato here? He talked about all of these things when he talked about forms. The awareness of that makes you understand what illusion you've been living in. Okay, it makes you understand how far you are from perfection. It makes you see how finite and imperfect your life has been. It makes you realize you've been living a life of true illusion. So think again about Plato's allegory of a cave, the one who stands up and looks around and sees what's really going on beyond the shadows and then actually tries to leave the cave. This is what she's talking about. At this point, the mystic realizes what they must do to become a true mystic and to have true unity with the beauty, with the absolute, with this taste of just pure joy that they've had. So they have to undergo a process of purgation. And that's the second step, self-mortification, asceticism, if you will. You've heard of spiritual adepts in just about all religions who practice some sort of fasting, not eating during or drinking during certain times, celibacy. There's different ways of doing it, but just it's basically a concept of purging the physical senses, and the belief that in doing that, it will help you aim yourself more towards and be more receptive to the actual pureness, what's beyond the senses, what's reality. So anyway, you go through this sense of purification. And then once you do that, you hit the third stage, which she calls illumination. And it's a state of happiness. It's an awareness of being in the presence of God, of reality, of perfection, of divinity. You're in the presence, and it's wonderful. It's a period of spiritual growth. It's a period of more intense joy. It can include visions, seeing God, seeing, a lot of people experience this as seeing light. In my book about dreaming as a sacred art, and doing a lot of research on dreaming, a lot of people perceive the infinite as pure light, that sort of thing. Locutions, where you hear voices talking to you. John of the Cross wrote about this in his beautiful, poetic, mystical poetry. Um, Wonderful things happen, but along with all of this, you get a certain sense of apprehension about God, about the absolute. You know you're in the divine presence, but you haven't actually united with it. Okay, so according to Underhill, a lot of people just stay in this. A lot of people on the mystic way just stay in this state and don't want to go beyond. But those who very, very deeply want to go beyond and feel a total unification without any apprehension with the absolute go through what is known as the dark night of the soul. And it is as foreboding as it sounds. I'm pretty sure John of the Cross was the one who coined this term, if you will, when he was in prison and going through his very deep mystical experiences. And he wrote a gorgeous poem called The Dark Night of the Soul. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But it's also called The Mystical Pain or Mystical Death. And that's divine absence. It's like you know what beauty is, and you're learning to discern satisfaction of the mystical vision from what the true mystical life is. And you know there's a difference, and it's hurting you. And it's like all of a sudden, in all the accounts, once you have this feeling of presence, you start to lose it. And it's a sense that the divine reality is pulling away because there's something you have to do in order to get it back and unite completely with it. And in this case, Underhill says, and others have said, John of the Cross talked about this at length. Saint Augustine of Hippo talked about it at length. A lot of the mystics talk about it at length. You have to, at this point, not just sort of get over your senses, but you have to get to where you let go of your will and you just totally, totally allow God's will to overcome your will. You give up your sense of of personhood, if you will. I have a quote here from Underhill's book because I can't say it as well as she could. She says the human instinct for personal happiness must be killed. She goes on to say the self now surrenders itself, its individuality, and its will completely. It desires nothing, asks nothing, is utterly passive, and is then prepared for the fifth stage, which is union, the unit of life, which is the goal of the mystic quest, which she calls a state of equilibrium of purely spiritual life, characterized by peaceful joy, enhanced powers, and intense certitude. How wonderful. So I think what we have to all ask ourselves is, do we think that this sort of union is possible? Do you think Ultimate unity with the divine is worth what you have to go through with the purgation and the dark night of the soul. Is it, do you think it could be worth all that? And what I would really like to know is if you ever had an experience that you believe is mystical. I know I certainly have. And if you're willing to share, again, it's, as Underhill says, there's no real words for it. But anything you might want to share, if you leave as a comment, I would very, very much appreciate it because we could all share that and benefit from it, and it would give me a chance later on to maybe talk some more about it, or maybe have guests on the show who are willing to share that. I think that would be quite fascinating. But anyway, share any experiences you might have had if you are so inclined to do so. I want to invite you to check out my new book, The Sculptor and the Saint. It's #1 bestseller on Amazon in several categories. Takes place in Renaissance Rome. Saint Cecilia, who lived in ancient Rome, her body was exhumed in the year 1599, and the Pope commissioned Stefano Maderno at 23 years of age to sculpt the statue, which was to go. And when they exhumed the body, he actually looked at the exhumed body, which for 1,300 years had been dead, said it looked just like this, and he sculpted her. But throughout the process of doing that, he has this sort of mystical experience, this union with God through Cecilia and through stories about her and her purity and what she went through. And he's trying really, really hard to be as pure as she reportedly was. And he goes into a state, he sculpts in a trance of mystical ecstasy, which in the mystical world is called creative ecstasy. And Underhill talks about this at length too, and I want to talk more about it in my vlog that I intend to do next month, my next vlog. And the person, the woman that I'm going to focus on then, that she started it person, is the very, very fabulous Hildegard of Bingen, who lived in the 12th century and had mystical experiences, which she expounded on in many ways. She was a visual artist. She was a composer. She wrote works that are still recorded and still used in churches today. She was an alchemist. She healed through crystals and rocks, a healer, an herbalist, the poet. The list of what this woman could do goes on and on and on. And she really was a Renaissance woman long before the Renaissance even really started. So if you're interested at all in art, in ecstatic art and things you might be able to create while you are in a state of mystical ecstasy, you might want to subscribe because you don't want to miss it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And before I go, please visit my website. You can get a sneak peek at my next novel, The Snake Priestess, which is really about the relationship between the ancient priestess of Crete and a very, very mystical experience she has in serving the great goddess there, who I termed as Asasara because that term comes up a lot in the sacred temples and all, and there's conjecture that may well have been the name of the great goddess, or at least one of the goddess figures there. So anyway, if you're interested in that sort of thing, please check that out. I wish you peace, grace, and joy, and mysticism, if that's what you want. And I hope to see you back again next month. Take care.